Welcome to Cabeza de Vaca. Episode 9, Out of Slavery. I'm Brandon Seale. It had been almost 1 year since 12 of Cabeza de Vaca's fellow expeditionaries had left him behind on Galveston Island, but he harbored no grudge toward them. How could he? They'd made every effort to try and bring him along, but in the sad state that he was in at the time, they couldn't even be sure he was coherent enough to understand their words. After his companions had left him, sometime in the spring of 1529, Cabeza de Vaca actually managed to recover from his illness, though. He was sustained, perhaps, by a sense of obligation toward the two other expeditionaries who had also been too sick to travel with the 12. One of the two, the expedition's notary, died in the coming months, leaving only that hardiest crew member from Cabeza de Vaca's ill-fated raft, Lope de Oviedo. Yet he wasn't the man that he once was. The experience of his first year on Galveston Island had taken a toll on him. This is because as soon as the novelty of the Narvaez expeditionaries had worn off on their native hosts, the Cabocles, as they called themselves, well, so too had their welcome. A big part of this had to do with the fact that their arrival coincided with the outbreak of some terrible, unidentifiable disease that killed 80 or 90% of their own number and almost half of their native hosts as well. Especially in the moment we're currently living through here in 2020, these numbers have new, poignant significance to us. We rightly react with horror at the idea of a disease that could kill 1 or 2% of our population. But 50%? 80%? We can't even imagine how we'd react to that. Some of the natives openly blamed the expeditionaries for the disease, probably correctly, and it's a testament to their generosity that they didn't just kill off the strangers in their midst. But they didn't, and even after most of the surviving expeditionaries had left, Cabeza de Vaca and Lope de Oviedo were allowed to remain amongst them. Of course, because of their unfamiliarity with the environment, Cabeza de Vaca and Oviedo proved themselves to be pretty useless by the standards of Texas native men in the 16th century. Their hosts set them to work doing menial tasks like carrying firewood, fetching water, and digging for roots until their fingers bled, traditionally women's work, so to speak, in these societies. But as the expeditionaries struggled to perform even these tasks well, their treatment worsened. Food was withheld, and then the physical abuse began. Slowly, but surely, Cabeza de Vaca and Oviedo found themselves reduced from guests to unwanted visitors to, in their view, slaves. Cabeza de Vaca skips over this dark first year on Galveston Island in the course of a single paragraph. But one of the things we've learned about reading Cabeza de Vaca is that the less he has to say about something, the more difficult it really was for him. In fact, his confessions of despair are so rare in the narrative that we can actually count them here on one hand. First, there's the moment when it became clear that their Florida expedition had failed and that the horsemen in their midst were plotting to abandon the rest of the men. Second, back on the rafts in the Gulf of Mexico, when they'd been without fresh water for days and, quote, there was not a one of us who did not expect to die at any minute, end quote. Third, that moment when the Gulf had violently thrown them back onto Galveston Island, naked, trembling, and without any hope or means of escape. And then fourth, at the beginning of this year, when Cabeza de Vaca had realized that he was too weak to go on toward Pánuco with the rest of his companions and would likely die here on Galveston Island. In each instance, he only refers to his despair elliptically, with language like, I'll refrain from belaboring this point, or I pass over this episode quickly, or any one of you can imagine what happened. And this is such a well-established pattern that it suggests to me that it's some kind of coping strategy, maybe even a technique that Cabeza de Vaca had learned for dealing with misfortune. By contrast, whatever techniques his comrade, Lope de Oviedo, was using to deal with his hardship weren't working nearly so well. Oviedo, at one time, the quote, strongest and hardiest, began to withdraw in on himself. Recall that when they had first been shipwrecked on Galveston Island, Oviedo had been one of the few who could even stand up. And then he had willingly and energetically climbed a tree and gone out to explore the island, when the rest of the crew could only crawl. Now, despite the ongoing abuse of his keepers, he refused to even entertain leaving the island. And with time, it became clear to Cabeza de Vaca that it wasn't illness that was holding him back. It was his own fear of what might happen to him if he did leave. I'm not qualified to use the technical terms, but it seems like he's suffering from some kind of PTSD. The certainty of his suffering on Galveston Island was less frightening to him than the uncertainty of whatever lay beyond. Finally, one day, Cabeza de Vaca couldn't take it anymore. Quote, "I could no longer endure the life that I had," end quote. Sometime in the summer of 1530, Cabeza de Vaca decided to look for something better. He didn't want to leave Lope de Oviedo entirely behind, and it says something about the nature of his slavery that he was able to choose a new master here. But what he decided to do was to simply cross over to live amongst the Indians, quote, "in the woods on the mainland," end quote. Still close enough by that he could keep tabs on his companion. But this is also the first clue that we have of a pronounced distinction between coastal Indians and inland Indians in this part of the world. In short, the Indians that lived inland seemed to be much more agreeable. You actually see this reflected too in much of New Spain, where the patterns of Spanish settlement favored the central highlands over the more savage coasts. And it was certainly a difference that the inland versus coastal Indians themselves observed, as they were in a state of, quote, "continuous warfare," end quote, according to Cabeza de Vaca. As evidence for this, he points out that some tribes went so far as to light false campfires outside their camps each night to draw away any would-be attackers, and some even slept in trenches dug around their campsite rather than in their actual lodges in case their houses were ambushed in the middle of the night. Cabeza de Vaca identified a market opportunity for himself in this state of affairs. Because of this constant conflict, trade was all but non-existent between the inland and the coastal tribes. Any merchant from one tribe daring to venture into the other's territory, even with an innocent commercial intent, would have been killed on the spot. But as any inland or coastal Indian could see, Cabeza de Vaca was not from the mainland or from the coast. He was some kind of curious, non-threatening other. Incidentally, this kind of merchant work of going between tribes, just like the manual labor that he had been assigned back in the Caboca camp, were traditionally women's work as well. In this world at war, trade goods and peace between Native American communities often came in the form of a woman, which is the title of a great book by Juliana Barr about exactly this. And yet there's something about Cabeza de Vaca that makes him uniquely able and probably uniquely willing to assume this traditionally women's role. After all, he was already doing quote-unquote women's work back on Galveston Island, and nothing in his cultural tradition stigmatized making a profit off of other people's petty antagonisms. And there's at least two clues in his account that he may have had a competitive advantage in trading with Native Americans. The first clue comes from this line, where Cabeza de Vaca is admiring how the natives, quote, "judge the seasons by the ripening of fruit, by the time that fish die, and by the appearance of the stars, and in all of this they are very clever and expert," end quote. But none of the natives, he continues, quote, "know how to reckon the seasons by either sun or moon, nor do they count by months and years," end quote. All right, and here's a second clue. There's an instance later on in his narrative where some of the natives around him refuse to scrape deer hides, thinking it's a waste of time, out of fear that they'll starve if they don't use every waking minute to forage. But Cabeza de Vaca is able to kind of calculate that the time taken to harvest the little scrapings of meat on the deer hide will actually yield far more calories per hour than panicked foraging, and so he willingly takes on the task, earning himself a few hides in the trade as well. All of which is to say that Cabeza de Vaca may have been working with a more developed mathematics than the people amongst whom he was trading. Whatever his advantages, whatever his motivations, according to Cabeza de Vaca, quote, "This occupation was good to me, because as long as I was in it, I was free to go where I wished, and I wasn't obliged to do anything, and I wasn't a slave. And wherever I went, they treated me well and gave me good food to eat, end quote. He traveled as far as 40 to 50 leagues inland, he claims, 120 to 150 miles, carrying, quote, snail shells with which they cut a kind of bean which they use for cures and in their religious festivals, end quote. In exchange for these snail shells, he brought back to the coast, quote, hides and red ochre with which they paint and dye their face and hair, flint for arrowheads, glue and hard canes with which to make arrows, and tassels made of deer hair, which they also paint and dye red, end quote. And just by way of independent corroboration, almost all of these goods are found at the Mitchell Ridge archaeological site on Galveston Island, confirming that this kind of trade indeed existed at this time. When I started researching the story of Cabeza de Vaca, my original plan was to show him meeting with Proto-Carancawas, Hasanes, Tonkawas, Coahuiltecans, Apaches, Humanos, and all the Texas Indian tribes that we recognize from the accounts of Europeans arriving in Texas in the 17 and 1800s. But as I alluded to in the previous episode, scholars frown on this approach as, quote, discredited and anachronistic, end quote. And this is because three major forces were at play between the 1500s and 1700s that were radically reconfiguring the ethnographic map of native Texas. The first, and perhaps most disruptive factor, was disease. Soon after Cabeza de Vaca's arrival, indeed, the sickness that decimated the Cabocles suggests that it may have been because of his arrival, Old World diseases began to sweep through the native tribes of Texas and northern Mexico. According to archaeologist Carolyn Boyd, the archaeological records suggest that Cabeza de Vaca may have stumbled into Texas at precisely the moment of its greatest native population. And yet this same land that Cabeza de Vaca can't travel more than a day or two in without running into a Native American village would be known to later Spaniards just 150 years later as the, quote, despoblado, the unpopulated region. Second, the author of one of my favorite works on Cabeza de Vaca, Professor Andrés Reséndez, has written an entire book arguing that the enslavement of Native Americans by Europeans may have played an even greater role than disease in decimating native populations. I haven't read the book, but I trust that its premise is well supported, if for no other reason than that so much of Cabeza de Vaca's narrative will later show us the devastating effect of the enslavement of Native Americans on communities in Mexico. Lastly, and the third major factor, what makes it so difficult to tie the Texas natives of 1530 to the better documented tribes of the 1730s was that most of them didn't seem to think of themselves as belonging to the kinds of sweeping, broad ethnic categories that Europeans are fond of. And Europeans would continue to make this mistake well into the 19th century, insistently negotiating treaties with one band of natives that frustratingly had no impact on the behavior of other bands that spoke the same language. The scattered natives of Texas were, more often than not, just loosely related peoples speaking broadly similar languages and living according to similar lifestyles, not nation-states like we like to imagine them. All that said, indulge me for a second here, and let me try to shoehorn in a little discussion about the Hasiné Caddo Indians, amongst whom the first East Texas Spanish missions would be planted 200 years later. Because the Hasiné were quite an advanced society, if we want to use that term. And if Cabeza de Vaca had traveled 50 leagues north from Galveston Island, he very likely would have met them. They actually constituted the western arm of the same Mississippian cultural group whose southeastern arms reached into the parts of Florida that the Narvaez expeditionaries had encountered back in Apalachee. But by 1530, the Hasiné's sedentary agricultural society was in a bit of decline, although they still lived amongst their ancestors' massive mounds and beehive-shaped lodges with mud-plastered walls. They were among the best dressed of the Texas tribes at the time, covering themselves in hides dyed black and decorated with beads, shells, and bones, or of clothing woven from nettles and mulberry bark. They wore their hair shaved or plucked along the sides, with long mohawks, sometimes tied up in man buns and decorated with feathers. The men's bodies would have been tattooed with animals, while their faces would have been marked by sharp lines running from the forehead down to the nose and the tip of the chin. The women's bodies would have been tattooed with swirling floral and leaf designs, while their faces too would have been marked by sharp lines running vertically down their cheekbones. And as we alluded to, The Hasene were a settled, sedentary, agricultural society. They raised corn, for which reason, among others, later Franciscans placed great hopes on them as the group of Texas natives most amenable to conversion and assimilation into the Spanish mold. And so why doesn't the consummate anthropologist Cabeza de Vaca tell us anything about such an impressive nearby civilization? It's clear to me that he would have mentioned them if he'd met them, given how obsessed the expeditionaries had been, and later would be, with finding corn-raising societies. But how did he avoid their footprint altogether if he really traveled as much as he said he did? Well, some have argued, because of odd omissions like this, that maybe Cabeza de Vaca was never really a merchant at all, at least not on the scale that he holds out. One contemporary author has theorized that it may have been Andrés Dorantes, or even Esteban, and not Cabeza de Vaca, who had really been the merchant. That Cabeza de Vaca simply later appropriated their stories to make his own more interesting. The novelist Leila Lalami, in her fictional retelling of Cabeza de Vaca's journey, theorizes that Cabeza de Vaca may have spent these mysterious years when he claims he was a merchant actually married to a native woman and living fully as an Indian, something that he never could have published or admitted to in a Spanish Inquisition-controlled printing press. Others argue that there's actually an easier explanation here. Cabeza de Vaca just probably never traveled very far inland, much less to the north where the Hasene lived. Indeed, the literal translation of the passage makes it sound like most of his travel was along the coast itself, where he could play that inland coastal Indian arbitrage. Quote, "With my dealings and my wares, I went deep inland as far as I pleased, and along the coast for 40 or 50 leagues," end quote. Me alargada is the word in Spanish. Plus, if he had traveled north toward the Hasene, it would have been in the demonstrably wrong direction from where he thought he needed to go, which was down the coast, south, toward where they thought the Rio Panuco must be. And so staying close to the coast, even if it meant going up and down for 40 or 50 leagues, helped him to explore, to learn the territory, and to, quote, find out the best way to move forward, end quote. And yet during all this time, and for all the freedom that being a merchant gave him, Cabeza de Vaca never forgot about his companion, Lope de Oviedo. He felt a real sense of duty toward Oviedo, if not even comradeship or affection. And so every winter, Cabeza de Vaca stopped his trading and traveled back to Galveston Island, the island of ill fate, as he had once called it, where Lope de Oviedo still lived. And every year he would give him the same speech, trying to motivate him to flee with him to the south. He told Oviedo that thanks to his travels, he was much more confident now in his ability to navigate the continent. And in a twist on the old Castilian notion of glory that the Narvaez expeditionaries had originally sought, Cabeza de Vaca's trading had purchased for him a reputation of sorts, a reputation that preceded him and helped protect him. Celebrity has its practical benefits, beyond just the gratification of ego. And furthermore, his trading had brought Cabeza de Vaca new intelligence about the lands that lay ahead. And maybe, just maybe, he had heard rumors of others like them enslaved by tribes further down the coast. Perhaps he'd heard a rumor that at least one of the 4 strong swimmers that they had dispatched back in November of 1528 was still alive. Or maybe even he'd heard that several of the 12 castaways who had left the previous spring were still out there somewhere. And yet Oviedo said no. Time and time again, he said no. There was always some excuse. Not this year, not yet. It's not a good time. Yet Cabeza de Vaca was, if nothing else, persistent. In the spring of 1532, in his 3rd year now on the Texas coast, Cabeza de Vaca returned to Galveston Island, resolved to try one last time to convince or inspire his fellow expeditionary to ir adelante, to move forward, or to leave on his own without him. On the next episode of Cabeza de Vaca. Thank you for listening. You know, I've been remiss so far in not highlighting all the contributions that Texas State University in San Marcos has made to the study of Cabeza de Vaca. Their Center for the Study of the Southwest has really kind of owned the subject matter, and along with the Whitty Museum here in San Antonio, has published some really great resources on their website, which I'll link to. If you enjoyed this episode and think this is a story worth sharing, please tell one friend. And if you haven't already, please go rate and leave a review for us on iTunes, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. And don't forget to check out the webpage associated with this episode on therivardreport.com, home of nonprofit journalism for a better San Antonio. Editing for this episode was performed by Susana Canseco, sound engineering by Stephen Bennett. The music for this series is entitled Apache. It was composed by Kevin Graham and is available on Soundstripe. A special thanks to Father David Garcia, to Dr. Frank de la Teja with the Texas State Historical Association, to Steve Davis, curator of the Whitliff Collections at Texas State University, to Professor Andres Resendez at the University of California, Davis, to Dr. Carolyn Boyd with the Shumla Archaeological Research and Education Center and also Texas State, and to David Dunham with Texas Monthly for all their support and suggestions. You'll hear more about them throughout the season. And for more information about us and our other projects, you can check out our website at www.brandonseale.com.